During the hot months of 1944, the fighting across the European continent had entered what would become its concluding phase. Forces from Britain and America, having established their position on the Norman coast, were now driving their way through French territory toward the German border, while simultaneously, from the opposite direction, Soviet armies were forcing the German military machine backward across the vast plains of Eastern Europe. Despite the pressure from both directions, one type of obstacle continued to present itself with stubborn regularity on every battlefield: the rivers themselves. Wide, flowing with considerable force, and frequently stripped of their crossing structures by retreating forces, these waterways represented what German military leadership considered to be natural defensive positions, geographic features that would impose delays measured in weeks upon any attacking force. Along the banks of major rivers such as the Seine in France, the Dnieper in the Soviet territories, and eventually the legendary Rhine itself, a competition of engineering capability was taking place, and the outcome was not what German strategists had anticipated. Throughout the entire span of military history, rivers had functioned as critical factors in determining the outcome of campaigns. Generals and field marshals across the centuries had consistently regarded these natural features as boundaries that could not be easily breached, compelling entire armies to halt their advances, reorganize their logistics, or commit to extraordinarily costly assaults simply to establish a presence on the far bank. In the western portions of Europe especially, rivers like the winding Seine and the formidable Rhine had served as defensive barriers for generation after generation. When the German armed forces began their withdrawal across France during the summer and autumn of 1944, the Führer and his military staff operated under the assumption that these rivers would provide them with desperately needed time to pull together their fractured units and rebuild divisions that had been shattered in combat. Intelligence assessments coming from German sources suggested that constructing bridges capable of supporting military operations across such rivers while under hostile conditions would require the enemy to invest weeks or potentially even months in the effort. This calculation drew heavily upon historical precedent, upon the experiences of earlier conflicts when enormous trains of pontoon equipment and slow-moving construction battalions represented the only means of spanning significant water obstacles. What escaped the full comprehension of German planning staffs was the degree to which the Allied war machine had revolutionized the entire field of military engineering, transforming it from a support function into an instrument of operational tempo and tactical surprise. Beginning with the campaigns fought across North Africa, the combined forces of Britain and the United States had developed techniques for improvising river crossings in timeframes measured in hours rather than the traditional calculation of days. The engineers of the Red Army, facing their own unique challenges, had been refining methods for forcing river passages since the desperate days of 1941. Compelled by necessity to master the art of crossing the countless waterways that crisscrossed Ukraine and the Belarusian territories. By the time 1944 arrived, the specialized river crossing formations within all the major Allied military establishments were equipped with modular bridging systems, factory-produced pontoon sections, and substantial ferry equipment specifically engineered to transport armored vehicles. The entire philosophy governing these operations had undergone a fundamental transformation, shifting away from cautious, methodical construction toward lightning-fast improvisation with the explicit purpose of preventing German forces from establishing coherent defensive positions. The German High Command had overlooked this evolving threat. Their defensive calculations continued to revolve around the destruction of permanent bridge structures and the fortification of riverbank positions, maintaining confidence that the natural barrier of flowing water would impose sufficient delay to allow reserve formations to reach threatened sectors. While Wehrmacht engineering units demonstrated considerable skill in demolition operations, they fundamentally underestimated the resourcefulness and adaptability being demonstrated by their opponents. Compounding this misjudgment, the German military was increasingly hampered by critical shortages of fuel and transport capacity during the war's later stages, creating situations where even when enemy forces succeeded in spanning a river, German units lacked the mobility necessary to contest these crossings effectively. In a cruel irony, the very waterways upon which German commanders had placed their defensive hopes began functioning as obstacles to their own forces, cutting off avenues of retreat precisely when Allied engineering teams demonstrated their ability to bridge them with remarkable speed. As the summer of 1944 progressed, Allied command staffs were already developing operational concepts in which entire armoured formations would achieve crossings within mere hours of initially encountering a river obstacle. Reports describing the remarkable pace of Allied advancement following the Normandy breakout began circulating through German command centres, though many officers receiving these reports dismissed them as battlefield exaggerations or propaganda. Only a minority within the Wehrmacht understood that an entirely new discipline of combat engineering had been developed with the specific purpose of eliminating the river as a meaningful barrier to offensive operations. The assumption that safety could be found behind water barriers was about to be revealed as one of the most expensive miscalculations committed by German strategic planning. This account begins not with the dramatic sounds of massed artillery or the spectacle of tank assaults, but rather with the more subtle noises of steel pontoon sections being manoeuvred into position and the steady drone of engines. During that final year of the Second World War, the velocity at which floating bridge structures could be assembled while under direct enemy fire became a factor of decisive importance. Victory did not rest upon brute military force alone, but equally upon technical ingenuity and the organizational capacity to construct in hours what previous generations would have required days to accomplish. When German military staffs were engaged in planning the defense of their homeland, they consistently treated rivers as features offering strategic certainty. Throughout the closing stages of the conflict, commanders positioned along both the Western and Eastern theatres placed enormous faith in these natural obstacles. They calculated that major waterways, such as the Seine, the Meuse, the Oder, and most critically the Rhine itself, would impose delays upon enemy advances sufficient to permit German divisions to reorganize and mount effective counter-offensives. This confidence was not entirely without foundation in historical experience. Throughout centuries of warfare, military forces had routinely depended upon rivers to anchor their defensive positions. What rendered the German reliance particularly dangerous, however, was the false sense of security it generated in the context of a conflict that had become progressively more mechanized and characterized by rapid movement. In 1940, when German armored and infantry formations had swept through France, they had themselves exploited river crossing operations as a method of rupturing enemy defensive lines. The German war machine had famously utilized a crossing of the Meuse River in the vicinity of Sedan, deploying pontoon equipment and assault watercraft to outflank French positions. It represented a bitter historical irony that merely 4 years later, German leadership failed to recognize that their adversaries had absorbed the lessons of those very operations and had refined the techniques on a vastly greater scale. The notion that rivers could function as impregnable defensive barriers persisted within German headquarters long after the fundamental character of the war had shifted decisively against them. Wehrmacht defensive doctrine leaned heavily upon a strategy of systematic destruction. German units conducting withdrawal operations received explicit orders to demolish bridge structures as they retreated, leaving behind the twisted wreckage of steel and shattered stone in the expectation that pursuing enemy forces would find themselves stalled for weeks at minimum. Following the Allied rupture of German lines in Normandy during August of 1944, bridge demolition became standard procedure across the front. In certain instances, such as the crossings at Rouen along the Seine, German engineer detachments prepared elaborate demolition charges designed to ensure that the structures would be rendered completely unusable. What German planners failed to anticipate was the capability of Allied forces to respond almost instantaneously with temporary replacement structures, effectively bypassing the delays that demolition operations were intended to create. A portion of this German overconfidence derived from their own increasing difficulties with large-scale engineering operations as the war progressed. By 1944, the German armed forces lacked the industrial capacity and logistical resources to maintain specialized bridging formations on any meaningful scale. Critical shortages of petroleum products and transportation assets meant that even in situations where German engineers possessed the technical to assemble pontoon bridges or ferry equipment, they frequently lacked the mobility to transport this equipment to critical locations within operationally relevant timeframes. Meanwhile, Allied industrial production had flooded the operational theatres with Bailey Bridge components, prefabricated pontoon sections, and specialised vehicles, ensuring that river crossing operations could be executed on a scale that the Wehrmacht could no longer hope to match. German strategic planning also incorporated significant psychological assumptions. Military leadership believed that wide rivers would serve as morale-destroying obstacles for attacking troops, compelling them into costly frontal assaults against fortified positions. Propaganda disseminated within the Reich boasted extensively that the Rhine would function as the nation's ultimate protective barrier, a natural moat defending the heartland. As Allied forces continued their advance, however, these proclamations became increasingly divorced from battlefield realities. Soldiers fighting at the front, particularly those engaged in continuous retreat across France and Poland, rapidly discovered that rivers no longer provided any guarantee of security. Many Wehrmacht veterans would later describe their shock at witnessing enemy armour and transport vehicles rolling across bridge structures that appeared to have been erected virtually overnight. The continued reliance upon rivers as sources of defensive security revealed a fundamental deficiency in German military thinking. The Wehrmacht continued operating within a conceptual framework inherited from the previous century, imagining that geography itself could provide time and protection against the realities of modern industrial logistics. In actual practice, rivers became less a form of protection than a test of organizational adaptability, and by the latter months of 1944, it was the Allied forces from America, Britain, and the Soviet Union who had achieved mastery in transforming these tests into demonstrations of superiority. The capacity of Allied forces to overcome river obstacles with remarkable speed was not the product of fortunate circumstance, but rather the result of deliberate technological development and organizational innovation. From the conflict's earliest phases, engineers from Britain, America, and the Soviet Union understood that bridging capabilities would prove essential to any sustained offensive into territories occupied by German forces. By 1943, with major offensive operations under active planning, the Allies had developed an extensive array of bridging systems engineered to be rapidly transported and assembled under combat conditions. Among the most celebrated of these innovations was the Bailey Bridge, a British development first introduced during operations in North Africa and subsequently deployed on a massive scale throughout the Italian campaign. The brilliance of its design rested in its modular construction, light enough to be transported in sections by standard military trucks, yet structurally robust enough when fully assembled to support armoured vehicles exceeding 40 tons in weight. For floating bridge operations, engineer formations relied extensively upon pontoon equipment. The United States Army invested heavily in pneumatic pontoon designs, which could be inflated and connected to form floating roadways within timeframes measured in hours. These were combined with steel treadway sections that permitted Sherman tanks and heavy trucks to traverse quickly once the pontoon foundation had been positioned. British forces, for their part, developed collapsible watercraft and assault rafts capable of ferrying infantry formations across rapidly flowing rivers before heavier equipment could be brought across. The Soviet Union pursued yet another approach to the problem. Soviet engineer troops mass-produced wooden pontoon sections and raft structures, supplemented by extensive stockpiles of captured or improvised materials, ensuring their capacity to improvise crossings even when formal bridge-building equipment was unavailable. The scale of Allied preparation was genuinely staggering in its scope. In advance of the Normandy invasion, thousands upon thousands of Bailey Bridge panels were accumulated in storage facilities across southern England. American logistics officers planned not merely for isolated crossings at one or two locations, but for a sustained offensive campaign across multiple river obstacles. Specialist formations, designated as Engineer Combat Battalions within the U.S. Army structure, and Royal Engineer Bridging Companies within the British military, received specific training to deploy bridge structures while under direct artillery bombardment and machine gun fire. The Soviets similarly organized entire bridge brigades, formations comprising thousands of personnel whose exclusive mission was the erection of river crossings under active battlefield conditions. Among the most critical developments was the integration of coordination between infantry formations, armoured units, and engineer battalions. Rather than treating bridge construction as an isolated support activity, Allied operational planners incorporated it directly into their tactical timetables. This meant that an advancing division would arrive at a river obstacle, already anticipating that a crossing would be prepared within hours. Tank formations were held in reserve only briefly, while engineer teams rushed pontoon equipment into position under the protective fire of infantry and artillery. The effect was to maintain operational momentum without interruption, denying German forces the operational pause they so desperately required to reorganize their defensive lines. Another significant innovation involved the deployment of amphibious vehicles. The American-manufactured DUKW, a six-wheeled truck capable of operating both on land and on water, proved invaluable during the initial phases of river crossing operations. Thousands of these vehicles, commonly known as ducks, were deployed throughout European operations, ferrying troops and supplies across waterways before permanent bridge structures could be established. Combined with mobile cranes, bulldozers, and other heavy machinery, they created a comprehensive toolkit of engineering capabilities that Wehrmacht forces could not replicate. By 1944, the contrast between German and Allied engineering resources had become stark and undeniable. The Wehrmacht had once pioneered aggressive river crossing operations, but its specialized bridging formations had been progressively degraded through combat attrition and resource shortages. The Allied forces, in contrast, had transformed military engineering into an industrial-scale element of warfare, approaching rivers not as insurmountable barriers, but as predictable challenges amenable to systematic solutions. For German commanders who continued to place their faith in natural defensive features, circumstances were aligning for a harsh awakening. Rivers no longer offered any promise of security, only opportunities for Allied forces to demonstrate their technical and organizational capabilities. The transformation of river crossings into swift, decisive maneuvers depended not solely upon new equipment, but equally upon the rigorous preparation of specialized personnel. By the time Allied forces conducted their amphibious landings in Normandy, entire battalions had undergone months of intensive drilling to execute complex bridging operations under extreme pressure. Within the U.S. Army, engineer combat battalions conducted exercises across England that simulated nighttime crossings under simulated enemy fire, with smoke screens deployed to obscure movements and aircraft providing overhead protection. British Royal Engineer formations likewise conducted repeated training exercises along the Thames and throughout training facilities across southern England, rehearsing procedures for assembling Bailey bridges in record time. What distinguished these preparation efforts was the overwhelming emphasis placed upon speed of execution. Military doctrine stressed repeatedly that delays at river crossing sites could unravel entire offensive operations. Consequently, engineer personnel received training to function effectively under conditions that closely replicated actual battlefield environments: darkness, mud, hostile fire, and chaotic coordination with armoured formations, waiting impatiently on the opposite bank. Soldiers developed expertise in handling heavy steel panels, inflatable pontoon sections, and assault watercraft with remarkable efficiency. Contemporary accounts describe engineer teams assembling complete spans in just a few hours that, merely a generation earlier, would have required multiple days to complete. Soviet forces operating across the Eastern Front, where rivers tended to be broader and environmental conditions often more severe, adopted even more demanding training protocols. Red Army sapper units drilled extensively in the use of storm boats, camouflage techniques, and rapid raft construction, utilizing locally available timber. They learned to transport not merely infantry, but entire artillery batteries across major rivers like the Dnieper. Soviet commanders expected their engineer formations to perform effectively while under direct threat from Luftwaffe air raids and German artillery concentrations, pushing personnel endurance to absolute limits. By the winter months spanning 1943 to 1944, Soviet bridging brigades had acquired a formidable reputation for their capacity to improvise under conditions that would have immobilized most military formations. A crucial element of this preparation involved logistics on an unprecedented scale. Constructing a pontoon bridge required immense quantities of material, tons of structural steel, timber, rubber pontoon bladders, and heavy transport vehicles. The U.S. Army alone shipped thousands of tons of bridging equipment across the Atlantic Ocean in preparation for the European campaign. In certain cases, entire convoy shipments were dedicated exclusively to transporting Bailey Bridge components, which could be offloaded at port facilities and moved inland via truck convoys. By the summer of 1944, Allied armies advancing through French territory maintained mobile stockpiles of bridging materials ready for immediate deployment. Coordination among different military branches represented another decisive factor in operational success. Air superiority, which Allied forces had achieved by mid-1944, permitted bridging units to operate without the constant threat of aerial attack that had plagued earlier campaigns. Smoke generator equipment was deployed to shield bridge construction operations from German artillery observation posts, while infantry units were assigned the mission of securing bridgehead positions on the far bank before engineer teams commenced construction. In numerous instances, tank formations and self-propelled artillery pieces provided covering fire directly from riverbank positions, creating a protective screen behind which engineers could work with relative safety. German forces, encountering these disciplined and superbly equipped formations, were frequently astonished by the speed of execution they witnessed. Reports from Wehrmacht officers describe genuine shock at observing entire armoured formations crossing bridge structures that seemed to materialise overnight. This rapid operational tempo resulted from relentless training, integrated planning across multiple military branches, and a fundamental recognition that rivers could no longer be treated as passive defensive features. By the latter stages of the war, Allied military forces had transformed bridging operations from an obstacle to be overcome into a demonstration of technological and organisational superiority. The initial genuine demonstration of Allied bridging velocity that truly shocked German command structures occurred during the dramatic pursuit across France in August 1944. Following the successful rupture of German lines during Operation Cobra, Allied armies surged eastward at a pace that caught German planners off guard. German defensive strategy had been predicated upon slowing this momentum by withdrawing behind the Seine River, calculating that its considerable width and the destruction of permanent bridge structures would stall enemy forces for a period measured in weeks. Wehrmacht demolition teams systematically destroyed crossing points near Paris, Rouen, and other locations along the river, anticipating that the advancing Anglo-American forces would find themselves halted long enough for reinforcements to establish a coherent defensive line further east. Instead, events unfolded in precisely the opposite manner. Within mere days of reaching the Seine's western bank, Allied engineer formations were already deploying pontoon equipment and Bailey Bridge components under active combat conditions. At the town of Vernon, British forces executed a bold assault crossing between the 25th and 27th of August, ferrying infantry across in storm boats before engineer teams erected a temporary bridge structure capable of supporting armour. Despite determined German resistance, the bridgehead was rapidly secured and tanks belonging to the Guards' armoured division were rolling across within 48 hours. The velocity of this crossing operation stunned German defenders, who had received assurances from their command structure that the river would hold British forces back for no less than 2 weeks. Along the American sector of operations, the pattern replicated itself with similar results. At Monte Gassicourt, elements belonging to the US 19th Corps forced a crossing of the Seine on August 19th, utilizing assault boats for the initial wave, with bridging battalions subsequently erecting a heavy pontoon bridge. Within less than 2 days, American armor was crossing in mass formations, driving deeply into German positions beyond the river. Another crossing operation at Melun enabled Patton's Third Army to exploit the breakthrough, advancing rapidly toward the Moselle. In total, Allied forces established multiple bridgehead positions across the Seine within a time frame of mere days, creating a strategic shockwave that reverberated through German command structures. The rapidity of these operations generated a devastating psychological impact upon German forces. Intelligence officers reporting to Berlin described Allied forces as appearing to disregard natural obstacles entirely, an admission that the long-held confidence in rivers as defensive barriers was collapsing. Many German units conducting withdrawal operations from Normandy found themselves unable to reorganize because Allied forces had crossed the Seine before their formations could establish coherent positions on the eastern bank. Survivors of these operations later recalled the chaos of attempting to retreat eastward, only to discover that Allied armoured formations were already advancing beyond the river line they had expected to defend. From a logistical perspective, the Seine crossings demonstrated how Allied planning had achieved near-industrial levels of efficiency. Entire convoys carrying bridging material moved forward directly behind the advancing spearheads, ensuring that necessary equipment remained constantly available. Pontoon sections were brought forward in carefully synchronized waves, while Bailey Bridge components followed via dedicated truck convoys. Each individual crossing represented less a singular achievement of field improvisation, and more the execution of a thoroughly rehearsed system that had been perfected through campaigns stretching back to North Africa. For German defenders, the Seine episode marked a fundamental shift in their understanding of their adversaries. The myth that river obstacles would impose meaningful delays evaporated within less than a week of contact. Officers who had confidently asserted that France's major rivers would provide natural defensive lines were compelled to confront a grim reality. Allied mobility, enabled and supported by rapid engineering capabilities, meant that even major waterways could not guarantee operational respite. From this moment forward, each successive withdrawal eastward carried an increasing sense of futility, as German troops realized that the enemy's demonstrated ability to span rivers within hours had effectively negated one of their most fundamental defensive strategies. While the Seine crossing operations shocked German command staffs in the west, it was across the Eastern Front that the true magnitude of engineering innovation became visible. The Red Army, advancing steadily westward from 1943 onward, confronted some of the largest rivers in Europe, the Dnieper, the Vistula, and ultimately the Oder. These waterways were not narrow channels, but genuinely massive obstacles, frequently measuring several kilometers in width, characterized by marshy banks and powerful currents. German planners anticipated that these rivers would halt Soviet offensives for months, particularly given the widespread destruction of permanent bridge infrastructure. Yet Soviet engineer formations, hardened through years of retreat and subsequent recovery, had achieved mastery in overcoming these formidable barriers through ruthless efficiency and organizational discipline. The most celebrated example occurred during the Dnieper offensive throughout the autumn of 1943. Following the liberation of Kiev, Soviet forces launched what became known as the Battle of the Dnieper, representing one of the most extensive river-crossing operations in military history. Entire armies were ferried across utilizing storm boats, improvised raft structures, and even makeshift flotation devices constructed from barrels lashed together. Soviet sapper units constructed pontoon bridges while under continuous artillery bombardment and air attack, frequently operating during nighttime hours, while infantry clung desperately to hastily assembled ferry craft. Despite suffering catastrophic casualties, the Red Army succeeded in forcing multiple bridgehead positions across the river within a period of weeks, overwhelming German defences that had been proclaimed impenetrable by propaganda. By 1944, Soviet bridging tactics had undergone further refinement and improvement. During Operation Bagration in June, engineer formations rapidly spanned rivers, including the Berezina and the Niemen, enabling armoured spearhead formations to maintain operational momentum deep into Belarusian territory. German troops submitted reports expressing astonishment at the speed with which Soviet pontoon bridges materialized, sometimes appearing within hours of a breakthrough in defensive lines. At the Vistula during January 1945, the Red Army constructed bridge structures sufficiently robust to support tanks and heavy artillery within a time frame of days, permitting the massive offensive toward Berlin to proceed forward without operational pause. Perhaps the most dramatic demonstration occurred along the Oder River during March 1945. German propaganda had proclaimed the Oder as the final great defensive wall protecting the approaches to the capital. Yet Soviet engineer formations, supported by massive artillery preparations and nighttime operations, established bridgehead positions almost immediately upon reaching the river. Temporary pontoon bridge structures were deployed despite flooding conditions and fierce German counterattacks. Within a brief period, heavy armour was traversing the river, establishing the conditions for the final assault on Berlin. German defenders, exhausted from continuous combat and critically short of supplies, found themselves overwhelmed through sheer determination and superior organization. German accounts describe profound disbelief at how entire divisions seemed to appear on the far bank overnight, despite the river obstacle that was supposed to provide protection. The Eastern Front campaigns also highlighted a brutal reality that could not be ignored. These crossing operations were achieved at an immense cost in human lives. Thousands upon thousands of Soviet engineers and infantry perished in the initial assault waves, frequently drowning under fire or succumbing to the freezing waters. Yet their sacrifice enabled the relentless momentum of Soviet offensive operations to continue. For the Wehrmacht, it demonstrated conclusively that no natural barrier, regardless of how wide or forbidding, could guarantee security once the Red Army committed itself to forcing a crossing. The illusions constructed around the Dnieper, Vistula and Oder collapsed in precisely the same manner as those surrounding the Seine, eroded not gradually over time, but through the demonstrated ability to construct bridges with astonishing rapidity. By the spring of 1945, the ultimate obstacle that loomed largest within German strategic calculations was the Rhine River. Extending across Western German territory, it had been regarded for generations as a natural frontier and was celebrated throughout German culture and historical memory as a symbol of national defense. The Führer himself had proclaimed that the Rhine would constitute an unbreachable barrier against the advancing Allied forces. Bridge structures along its entire length were systematically demolished, and defending forces prepared to contest any crossing attempt. The German civilian population, worn down through years of conflict and deprivation, placed their remaining hopes in the river as the final defensive line before the heartland itself. Yet Operation Plunder, launched by Allied forces during March 1945, would demonstrate with absolute finality that such confidence was entirely misplaced. The Rhine crossing operation was planned with meticulous attention to detail. Under the overall command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, combined British and American forces accumulated enormous stockpiles of bridging material along the western bank. Entire engineer divisions received assignments to construct pontoon and Bailey Bridge structures while under hostile fire, while deception operations successfully misled German intelligence regarding the actual crossing locations. Meanwhile, American forces under the command of General Omar Bradley and George Patton planned parallel operations further south along the river, ensuring that the crossing would not be concentrated at a single point, but would be executed across a broad front. Operations commenced on the night of March 23rd, when British and American infantry stormed across in assault boats supported by one of the most massive artillery bombardments of the entire war. Almost immediately following the initial assault, engineer formations moved forward, erecting treadway bridges utilizing steel pontoon sections. Despite fierce German defensive efforts, the first bridge structure suitable for supporting tank traffic was completed within a time frame of hours. By dawn on March 24th, Allied armour was already crossing, and within a period of days multiple crossing sites were operational, including a massive pontoon structure erected at Wesel. Perhaps the most dramatic episode, however, involved the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen by elements belonging to the US 9th Armoured Division on March 7th, weeks before Operation Plunder officially commenced. Contrary to all German expectations and planning, the bridge had not been completely destroyed in time, and American troops succeeded in seizing it while still intact. Engineer teams immediately reinforced the damaged structure, while simultaneously constructing pontoon bridges nearby to ensure redundancy of crossing capability. This surprise crossing created a bridgehead position across the Rhine far earlier than German planners had calculated as possible, accelerating the collapse of organized defenses. The sheer magnitude of the bridging effort represented an unprecedented achievement. Allied forces deployed hundreds of amphibious vehicles, assault watercraft, ferry equipment, and floating bridge sections, working continuously day and night to maintain supply lines across the river. Smoke screens blanketed extensive stretches of the river to obscure observation by German artillery spotters, while aircraft maintained absolute dominance of the skies, preventing the Luftwaffe from conducting effective interdiction operations. Within a single week, entire Allied armies were streaming across the Rhine, including endless convoys of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. For German defenders, the psychological impact was absolutely devastating. Soldiers who had been repeatedly told that the Rhine represented an impregnable barrier now witnessed enemy forces constructing pathways across its waters in record time. Reports submitted by German officers described widespread panic and disbelief, with some formations collapsing entirely before they could organize coherent counterattacks. The illusion of security behind the river barrier was comprehensively shattered, and with its destruction went the last coherent defensive position west of Berlin itself. Operation Plunder and the events at Remagen proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the historical era of natural barriers had concluded. The demonstrated ability to erect floating pontoon bridge structures within mere hours had fundamentally transformed the strategic landscape, rendering even Europe's most formidable rivers into obstacles only in theoretical terms. In actual operational practice, Allied engineering capabilities transformed them into little more than temporary inconveniences, requiring several hours to overcome. The German expectation that the Rhine would successfully hold back Allied advances dissolved almost instantaneously, paving the operational path for the final thrust into the Ruhr industrial region and ultimately toward the capital itself. By the closing weeks of the European War, the myth of rivers functioning as protective shields had disintegrated in its entirety. From the Seine to the Oder, the demonstrated speed and precision of Allied bridging operations had revealed a profound transformation in the character of modern warfare. Engineering capability had evolved into a decisive military arm, possessing importance equal to infantry, armoured forces, and artillery. German commanders who had once planned entire campaigns, founded upon the expectation that waterway obstacles would purchase them weeks of valuable time, now discovered themselves consistently outmaneuvered and outpaced at every operational turn. The rapid construction of floating pontoon bridges had exposed the fundamental vulnerability of static defensive thinking in an era where mobility and industrial production capacity dictated the outcomes of military engagements. One of the most consequential results of this collapse involved the paralysis of German retreat operations. Across both the Western and Eastern theatres of operations, Wehrmacht formations discovered that their carefully selected fallback positions, chosen specifically for their location along river lines, offered no genuine respite from pursuit. Instead, they frequently transformed into death traps. Entire divisions conducting withdrawals in the belief that a river obstacle would provide cover for their movements found themselves overtaken when Allied engineer teams spanned the obstacle during overnight operations. Along the Seine, Thousands of German troops were isolated and subsequently captured. At the Vistula and Oder, retreating formations found themselves encircled as Red Army bridging formations established crossing sites faster than German intelligence had calculated as possible. What had been envisioned as positions of safety became zones of isolation and entrapment. The collapse of this defensive illusion also generated enormous psychological consequences. German soldiers who had previously believed propaganda promises that rivers like the Rhine or Oder constituted insurmountable obstacles now personally witnessed armoured vehicles rolling across newly constructed pontoon spans within hours of their arrival at the riverbank. Interrogations of prisoners conducted by Allied intelligence personnel throughout 1944 and 1945 repeatedly highlighted expressions of disbelief among captured troops. Many admitted that they had received orders to maintain defensive positions only until river barriers could guarantee their security, a guarantee that evaporated in the face of Allied bridging capabilities. This erosion of faith in defensive positions undermined morale throughout German formations and accelerated rates of desertion. Beyond the immediate battlefield, these engineering achievements carried significant political and symbolic weight. The Rhine, celebrated for generations as a cornerstone of German national identity, was crossed by enemy forces not merely once but repeatedly during the spring of 1945. The rapid Allied bridging operations symbolized the comprehensive collapse of promises made by the Führer and the failure of his entire defensive strategy. For Soviet forces, storming across the Oder and pushing pontoon bridges toward Berlin carried equally powerful symbolic significance. The Reich's heartland was no longer shielded by geographical features. The propaganda value of these crossing operations was immense, demonstrating to soldiers and civilians throughout Germany that nothing remained capable of preventing the inevitable conclusion. Historians examining these events subsequently recognized that the bridging operations represented as much a triumph of industrial capacity as tactical brilliance. Allied forces possessed the capability to deploy thousands of trucks, mobile workshops, and prefabricated components, ensuring that bridging materials remained constantly available at points of operational necessity. German forces, starved of critical resources and crippled by perpetual shortages of fuel, equipment, and trained personnel, could not replicate this organizational achievement. Their continued reliance upon natural obstacles revealed not merely a fundamental misreading of modern warfare's character, but also their absolute inability to compete in the industrial competition that ultimately defined the conflict's outcome. By May 1945, as Germany lay in comprehensive ruins, the lesson had become undeniable. Rivers had forever lost their historical status as barriers offering any permanence of protection. The organizational capacity to improvise and construct under hostile fire within hours what previous generations would have required days to accomplish had decisively tipped the strategic balance. Floating pontoon bridges transcended their function as mere military tools and became symbols of historical inevitability, proving conclusively that no natural geographic feature could halt the advance of military forces equipped with the complete resources of modern industrial engineering. For German forces who had never anticipated such achievements as operationally possible, this realization arrived far too late, marking the final collapse of a defensive illusion that had once appeared unshakable to an entire generation of military planners and field commanders.